Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning or good evening to all of you, depending on whether you are joining us from Brussels or from Tokyo or from elsewhere in the world. I see that our virtual numbers are still rising, but in the interest of making good use of everyone's time, we will start as scheduled. My name is Alexander Matzelaar, and it is my pleasure to serve as your virtual host and to welcome you all very warmly to today's Egmont webinar on economic security in a changing world, a very topical issue because there are periods in time in which economic policy and security policy exists in quasi-isolation from one another. Independent from one another, taking their own logic. But then there are also times in history when the two get increasingly mixed up. And that is arguably what we are seeing today in debates over sovereignty, over contemporary security challenges. We see a growing concern, for instance, over the integrity of supply chains. We see rising concerns over the protection of critical infrastructure, especially when confronted with the ongoing digitalization of our societies, the cyber risks that entails, and so on and so forth. And there are, of course, the growing security implications of various advanced technologies. And this is really something that is very much on the agenda of policymakers all across the world. It is on the agenda in European capitals at the level of the European Union, but it is also very much debated and thought about in the respective partners of the European Union. And one particularly relevant example thereof is Japan. Only last Friday, and that is why we're also having this discussion today, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's cabinet approved a new legislative bill to boost Japan's economic security with the aim of managing various sort of risks that are associated with rapidly changing geopolitical and geo-economic circumstances that Japan finds itself in. And we are absolutely delighted to be joined today by a foremost Japanese security and technology expert, Professor Atsushi Tsunami, who is currently the president of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation and who also holds a variety of academic and advisory positions. You can read more about his bio on our website, but most notably, he also serves as a member of the expert panel that has been advising the development of this new economic security legislative package that has seen the light of day. And in his presentation today, Professor Tsunami will give us a unique insight in how this new legislative package came into being, what it exactly covers, and so on. In the panel debate that we will engage in afterwards, we will also take up the second part of today's webinar title, What Prospects for Europe-Japan Cooperation? Because what happens in the legislative sphere in Japan has consequences for the EU-Japan trading relationship and vice versa. And to that purpose, I would also like to warmly welcome our two panel discussants. There is Professor Cynthia Dubois, who is currently the chair of economics at the Belgian Royal Military Academy. And she has also taken up various advisory roles, including as a scientific advisor for the platform of scientific economic potential in the Belgian National Security Council framework. She is also a member of the strategic committee that is advising our Minister of Defense on the ongoing defense reforms for the Belgian Armed Forces. We're also joined by Tobias Geerke, who is within Team Egmont, our point man on the geo-economics portfolio. So he will also engage with this discussion on economic statecraft, bringing in the EU dimension and to the extent relevant, perhaps also share some insights from the situation in Germany. That by way of introduction. I will now hand over the floor to Professor Tsunami, and then we'll turn to the panel debate. Just for the participants in the audience, I would already like to highlight there will also be, of course, the possibility of asking questions. So please, if you have questions, you can already line them up in the Q&A chat box. And as we are in the Q&A period, you can also raise your virtual hands later on. But first, of course, we turn to the presentations. So Professor Tsunami-san, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander, for this very kind and nice introduction. And it is my great honor and privilege to have this opportunity to first introduce I think this is one of the first efforts by most of the countries to have the economic security as a comprehensive package of bill that is going to be introduced to the Diet. Today, I would like to take some moment, take some time to share with you what this bill is all about and what are the backgrounds and that is preparing for this bill, particularly in the context of Japan and how we feel the issue of economic security has been very much important for our own, not only for national security, but economic policy, as well as international relations and so on and so forth. And share some of the main pillars, the elements of this bill with you. And of course, this is just the initial step for us, and it's a first sort of the experience of this kind for all of us. And so we have to still, there are a lot of ongoing debates that is going on around this bill, so that I'm looking forward for this discussion later to get your insights on what are some of the challenges that we'll be facing, and especially joined by the two excellent panelists to share their views on this as well. So, anyway, as Alexander mentioned, this bill as a plan being approved by the Prime Minister Kishida's government cabinet last Friday. And now they're ready to be introduced to the Diet for the debate. And I've been asked by the House of Councillors next week to appear in the budgetary committee to debate on this bill as an expert. So it'll be a great sort of way of preparation for that. Then for next week, for this morning is discussions with you. So, but anyway, I have prepared some slides just to show you the contents of it, of the bill. So let me do the slides, the share, see, let's go, okay. Is it showing okay? Okay, great. So I don't know whether they still haven't yet this formal translation of the bill, name of the bill in English, but it is really as a direct translation of the bill that is going at the moment, called Economic Security Promotion or Law. And this has, again, had a group of experts, which I was one of them, that has been debated on the contents and some of the directions of this bill and the importance of this bill to be introduced this time in Japan for a few months, actually, later last year. And then, along with this this is a complicated bill, so it has a lot of about maybe quite a few experts, and we have divided into several groups and to have more in-depth discussions and debate on each one of those, and which I will show you that the law has 4 pillars that is going. That's sort of the main part of the bill, and so the experts were divided into 4 groups. And then each one debated on that particular point. But I'm not going to get into the detail today because it's just we don't have much time. But I'll just give you the sense of what kind of sort of the issues that we have been debating, and some of the things that this law would address, and some of the things that this law doesn't address. So the background, as Alexander mentioned, of course, we all understand the importance of economic security with really the heightened sort of a competition between U.S. and China in high tech and sort of a geopolitical competition between the two, as a sort of challenging for each one's what we call techno-hegemonic power. And of course, this really comes with a really, not too surprising to me, but the emergence of China's power in science and technology, and as a great power in that field. There are a lot of things that we studied about China, and my focus was on science and technology and in China's context. But I can see how they really obtained the kind of a status and the place where they are now, since particularly after 1980s, that they have been focusing on really reforming their own way of managing science and technology development. A lot of it, they study a lot about the Western practices, some of the good examples and bad examples. They have spent so much effort in reforming their top universities to be one of the greatest world universities to join that group of top universities in the world. Now we see that some of the top Chinese universities are already getting there. They have trained all the young scientists and engineers. They brought them all and encouraged them to study abroad, and they'll come back and have a special position in China so that they have more incentive to come back to China and support the development of Chinese science and technology. You have all sorts of examples and reasons how China that has got to where they are today in terms of science and technology. And with that, of course, with China's very set goal, what we call the Made in China 2025, and then we have all these China's Xi Jinping's very set target for 2049, where the China itself faces, or actually get the 100th year of their anniversary, and to be the top of their, in manufacturing and high tech and very strong China economic power by then. And the goal is already set, and we see the real progress towards that end. And so I think this competition for whether you think it's a good idea, whether you accept it or not, but the competition between U.S. and China, particularly around this techno-hegemonic position, is real, and having in Japan being placed between U.S. and China, we feel it very, very seriously on this end. And then, of course, the other issue is the rise of the importance of dual-use technology. Particularly, we see a lot of discussions on the importance of the utilization of AI or robotics, drones, automated technologies, all of these things that are, we call it dual use technologies that are very much getting importance. And the traditional sort of argument for the this export control regime is really has to be reviewed again to see whether we have this kind of to be able to really work on this new emerging dual use technologies and see whether this sort of the current effectiveness, current export control regimes and the effectiveness of it is also being discussed. And so this is another sort of way we look at economic security from that end. And then, of course, we are now talking about economic sanctions against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And of course, that we are now debating on how to sanction about the whether controlling the export of say something like semiconductors and other key technologies to against Russia, and how viable that will be. And that shows the sort of the importance of what we call economic statecraft and the validity of the economic statecraft. It has always been a question in both in academic world and also in the practical field about the validity of this sort of economic sanctions and so on. But we realize that this is a very important tool for all of us to employ in some of the cases. And again, against that currently, that's what we are trying to do. And but for Japan, the first sort of the sense of this importance, really the recent ones came from 2010's China's export control of their what we call rare earth elements, the very key raw materials that are important to manufacture a lot of high-tech products, has been that China announced the imposition of export control of this material to Japan over the East China Sea and Senkaku Island issues that we had back then with China. And quickly, some of those key raw materials that are pretty much monopolized by the China, and that having that as China realizing that as their economic, that's very strong power, economic statecraft, that has something that from the Japanese side, we became very keenly aware of really quickly finding the alternatives, a way of making sure to protect the supply chain of those key important materials, not depending on one nation. And so that's also became the big so the beginning of the serious debate on this economic statecraft. And is Japan vulnerable from those kind of policy to remedy some of those dependency on these key materials to one or two countries. And then also there has always been a discussion about how Japan can play a much bigger role in terms of working together with the Western allies in many of the global challenges, and particularly when it comes to emerging technology and how can Japan leverage our own science and technology infrastructure and our science and technology capability to help Western allies in facing these challenges. And in order to do that, Japan should have some sort of way of managing our science and technology in terms of protecting and securing some of the information that are going out of Japan. Open science is something that is very important for, of course, for all the science activities. But when it comes to critical technologies, Japan should have some kind of legal and institutional framework to make sure that those critical technologies, especially when we are trying to co-develop or co-work with our Western allies, where they have their sort of means of managing and controlling some of the key technologies, not to be leaked or not to be used by other, parties that are not intended to share. So this is something that the background that led to the drafting and introducing of the economic security law in Japan. So quickly, having said some of those backgrounds, then as I mentioned, there are 4 pillars of the law that I try to address those issues. But most importantly, though, I think when we have debating for this to prepare this law, is the first sort of introduction of the law that says, as a basic principle, that to consider the sort of economic policy for the objective of national security concerns, and to have the comprehensive and effective policy tools. To have that state would allow the government and the relevant ministries to get into some of the economic and research and science technology area and activities for the sake of, say, national security concerns. And so they have now, because of this law, based on this law, that they would be more easily and backed by the law to engage in those areas that are traditionally say, well, it's, there's nothing, there has no legal means and background for the government to step in. And I didn't say to, of course, in this first principle says the government cannot regulate over to or, without the concerns of other things. I mean, and, there's always a clause there that says not to limit the way that the government can regulate some of the economic activities if it's related to national securities, but, it has to be also concerned with the some other negative effects and so on and so forth. But still, they're having this basic principle that allows the government to consider the economic policy as an important policy tool to meet the national security objective is something that is very unique. I mean, is going to be a very big first step for Japan in really making to step into this field. And the 4 pillars are following. One is the system for securing supply chain. And there has the point about investigate and identify key product, such as semiconductor batteries or rare earth materials or pharmaceuticals. And if the ones they being identified as a key products, then the relevant suppliers for those key products has to come up with plans and work with the government to make sure that their lessen their vulnerability from the foreign over dependence on the those key materials. So which allow the government to actually investigate and sort of try to draft some kind of plan with the key suppliers for this. The second pillar is the system for protecting critical infrastructure. That is really also a checking and directing, selecting business operators of those key infrastructures to implement necessary protection measures. And once you as an operator be selected as a key operator for this key infrastructure, then you have to work with the government to make sure that you're procuring some of the parts or some of the operating activities to be less dependent and more secure in many ways, and the government can also direct some of the key supply operators to follow some of the directions that are being placed by the government to make sure that the protection is the key infrastructure is well protected. Of course, this part gave a lot of discussions, actually raised some of the issues from our private sector, saying how much the regulations, how much of the government can really come in and say to the key operator, saying you should not do business with this sort of the partner, or you should stick here. I mean, getting into some of the usual business practices and under what sort of back context, or what sort of, in what sort of the kind of information that the government has, and and how do you implement that? And so that's still ongoing debate, but it has been sort of one of the key debate in this second pillar. And I'm sure that you probably can understand this, how difficult, how delicate this part is when it comes to economic security, the balancing the business operations and also the national security concerns. And the third pillar is about the development of emerging technologies through public and private partnership. So this is not much of, of course, we all understand the importance of development of these dual-use technologies and AI and other key technologies. But for the first time in Japan, the private and the public and private partnership to discuss this part openly, not openly, but have this rather big platform is a big step towards in this development. So, so this is the third pillar. And the fourth pillar is more straightforward. It's restricting the patent information disclosure, or what we call private patent measures, which we didn't have. We used to have this sort of private patent system before the world, up until the end of World War II. And then after that, we didn't have it. There has been always been a debate about whether we should bring back this system to our patent, to make sure that to manage the patent information and disclosure, if the patents are very much related to critical technology and so on and so forth. And I'll finish with this slides about the challenges ahead. I already mentioned that there are, of course, this law has a lot of challenges. The foremost is the what we call the penalties issue. Okay, so we talked about, in this law, it says that you should do, and the government can do than that. But one thing they doesn't say is that there's no penalties being imposed. So when it comes to implementation, then how much can government really direct some of the activities in the business sector, the private sector, for along this law? So this is it's an ongoing issue, and I'm sure that's something that a lot of our parliamentarians will be asking me this question next week in the diet session. There is still ongoing debate on this, but this law doesn't have this at the moment. And then with something that we talked about but never introduced formally in this bill is introducing what we call security clearance system. Again, something that we don't have. I'm not sure whether some of the countries in the EU all have this, but I know the US and other part has this, and we don't think that we need to have that extensive security clearance system. But also when we talk about engaging or bringing in some of the activities from private sector to the national security activities, we need to have this kind of security clearance, just to have the background check on some of the people that are working on this. Otherwise, we won't be able to share some of those activities or be shared by our allies in the same project. So we consider this also be important in the future. And then the think tank that would identify what are the key, when we talk about key infrastructure or key products or key technologies, for patent disclosure or not disclose, and that who tells that sort of where the information, sort of like an economic intelligence part of it is going to be very important. And we need to have the kind of research institute or think tank that would advise us on these area. So, and then at the end, of course, hopefully that we are trying to develop this law and system so that we can have more active engagement or partnership with Western allies in this key economic security area. And this is really our idea behind it. And so the people, we think that this would be a great step forward. Even to work with NATO and other allies in the very key economic security areas now, that would allow us to prepare in ourselves for this kind of a partnership with Western allies in this field. And at the end, of course, at the moment, the most sort of a very pressing issue is to come up with an effective economic statecraft policy vis-a-vis Russia's in the area, like say semiconductor and whatnot. So anyway, so these are all now is a hot issue. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share with you some of the debates that are going on in Japan. And I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tsunami-san, for providing us with this wide-ranging and in-depth overview of the law, the economic security promotion law that is now going through the legislative process in Tokyo. I think there are many similarities with debates that we're having in Brussels and other European capitals. So let me perhaps immediately turn to my panelists to expand a bit on this, providing remarks from their point of view. Perhaps starting with Sint. I know that this notion of economic security has also received some prominence in the new Belgian national security strategy that has been recently adopted. But Sint, you have also been following this debate about economic security from a conceptual point of view for a much longer period. So what's your take on the state of play in Brussels and the similarities and differences that we can observe between what's going on in Tokyo and what's taking place in European capitals?
Well, I think indeed that the fact that Japan is now probably the first country in the world who is really developing an economic security law and installing an economic security minister exemplifies the highlighted importance that different countries have for the aspect of economic security. To quote a British general, what constitutes a weapon no longer has to go bang. Indeed, we see that more and more countries are really diversifying, let's say, their forms of warfare and are fighting with diverse non-conventional instruments such as economic statecrafts. For some countries in the world, the line between security, economics, and diplomacy is really blurring. And as we see that for some countries, they turn more to economic as an instrument of statecraft. Economic statecraft also gains importance for policymakers in the world. And while we in Belgium have not come so far to install a Minister of Economic Security, I will keep this idea, of course. The topic is definitely on our political agenda, but we have more governments, so our administrative process is longer than in Japan, but as Alexander correctly highlighted, it has been included in our new national security strategy as one of the important policy orientations of this strategy. And a close look on this strategy reveals that actually the same categories are in that strategy as are being addressed in the new law in Japan. So as Tsunami-san was talking about the 4 categories, you really find these 4 categories in our national security strategy. So I will not go into detail again into these categories. And I think with respect to content, we are on the same line here. With respect to the execution of the policy, I think there's room for collaboration, and we can learn from the Japan experience. With respect to the practical translation of policy, I believe that this has to be a double balancing act. Firstly, I think we need to balance the need to guarantee openness and to prevent protectionism with the risk of being too naive. Sometimes this equilibrium reads as a paradox. It looks like there's a trade-off between economic and security, while I think that they're actually complementary to each other. You need a very strong security environment for your economy to flourish, but on the other hand, you need a strong economy, of course, to be able to guarantee security. I also think that we need to balance between positive and more restrictive measures. And I don't know where Japan finds this balance, but I think that in putting this policy into practice, we should not only focus on negative measures, such as, for example, restricting foreign direct investments or banning exports of technology. But I think we should also focus on positive measures, such as supporting our own economic fabric by creating a stimulating environment for R&D and R&T. And in this framework, I can maybe highlight the fact that also in Belgium, we're working on a directive in order to support the development of our defense and security industry and a technology sector in this sector. I think this is a very good example that of an initiative that exemplifies, I think, the change in mindset that we seem to have in Belgium with respect to protecting our economic scientific potential. But of course, again, I think we have to make sure that all players, of course, on the international scene play by the same rules. The recent complaint of the European Union against the misuse or abuse of intellectual property rights by Chinese companies such as Huawei exemplifies this fact. And I think it's important to create a level playing field for all players. And maybe also here, I think this is a field in which countries such as Japan and the EU can and should collaborate. And maybe finally, to draw a parallel with the conclusions on the effectiveness of economic sanctions, since Tsunami-san already referred to the sanctions, I believe that a part of the value of the exercise on drafting a policy on economic statecraft already lies in the signal that we send as a country or as a group of countries to the other countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sin. That's a very important point indeed, that the development of these legislative initiatives and measures already is part of the ongoing conversation on the stability of the international system. Now, for European states in particular, they're confronted with this emerging and rapidly evolving debate that is for them taking place at multiple levels, because in the Belgian case, as we know, Belgium being a federal country, there are already multiple layers of government to be taken into account, because part of economic policy competences are regionalized to a far-reaching extent, whereas national security still is very much a federal competency. And for Belgium, but that is the case for all EU member states, there is of course this EU level that is, as far as legislative responses in particular, is becoming increasingly important. And it goes actually beyond legislation, but also research funding, etc., etc. So perhaps Tobias, would you care to elaborate a bit on the EU level dynamics to all of this, and how you see this this debate evolve in Europe, and how it relates to strategic partners like Japan.
Thank you, Alexander, and thank you, Professor Tsunami, for this interesting introduction to what is happening in Japan. I was in Tokyo in 2019, and at the time there was also a new invention. It was an economic security directorate in the National Security Council in Japan, which already at the time was quite interesting how far Japan had moved in the organizational structure of economic security and also in the thinking. And obviously now with this law, it moves even further. Maybe start by looking at one episode that Professor Tsunami elaborated on, sort of the origin story, if you will, of Japan's reassessment of economic security, that export control of China on rare earths in 2010. Because that also had an impact in Europe. There was a big debate at the time. There was worries from business, from policymakers that this disruption, that Europe was quite dependent. The Commission already in 2008 said we are quite dependent on this. We have to do something about it. But what happened in Europe was that a case was brought to the WTO in 2011, together with the Americans, on China's export controls. They were unlawful, and in fact, Europe won. They also won the appellate body case, the second case in 2014. In other words, it took some time, but the system worked, right? Economic security of Europe, if you will, was secured by the WTO. And because this case was won and China complied, this sort of moved in the background a little bit again in Europe. Really only then until 2017 with the trade war with President Trump and the undermining of the WTO, and at the same time, of course, China's practices, we heard made in China 2025 and investment spree in Europe, that I think then was really a reassessment of in Europe taking place, that economic security can not only be guaranteed by international law, the WTO, or be left to the market itself, but there needs to be a more managerial aspect to it. There needs to be a more unilateral intervention in certain parts. And as Finn said, I think there's on all these four pillars that were introduced as part of the Japanese economic security law. I think on all of these four pillars, there's a lot happening at the EU level. Again, just have a couple minutes, but I can't really go into detail, but just highlight maybe a couple of them, because on some, I think Europe is also fairly advanced, comparatively speaking, and others not so much. I think perhaps most interesting on supply chain resilience, I think a lot has happened in the last 2 years, especially. This started with critical raw materials. The Commission already made some assessments and redid their assessments in the last 2 years, really highlighting very clearly where bottlenecks exist, where dependencies exist, and what potentially could be done. And during the COVID crisis, this really took up another level. The Council in 2020, the European Council tasked the Commission and said, please look into where we have strategic dependencies, and also please recommend some policies that we can do with it. And the Commission has done so. It released its first assessment last year, where it identified some 130 critical goods where there are vulnerabilities, where there are bottlenecks, where there are dependencies. And it said it will do so even more, further assessments. So on that front, I think the first step is where Europe is, the Commission has been doing a really good job. Of course, the second step is more difficult. Once you identify where you are dependent, perhaps, or where bottlenecks exist, how do you really go about resolving them? And that's my issue to speak later. On the second part, key infrastructure and key asset protections. Again, I think we've actually come quite a long way. This debate was totally brought to us in 2017, 2018, first with Chinese investment. We have a European investment screening mechanism. More and more member states have adopted lists and understandings. What is critical infrastructure? It didn't start out so well, this discussion, perhaps. on the 5G front. There was a lot of disagreement in Europe, but more and more, I think this debate is taking up place, as Alexander said, all across Europe. We know now semiconductors is clearly critical. The Commission has, for example, produced a list where it identified 22 critical technologies for civil and military applications. So point is, there's a lot of thinking, there's a lot of lists. Unfortunately, these lists are sort of not really in agreement yet. So just an example, in Germany, investment screening regulation is very specific in its annex of what actual technologies it wants to screen for. So not just saying AI, but saying really specific application and specific software that it screens for. It's very targeted already. In other countries, well, Belgium doesn't even have one yet, but other countries also adopt very broad conceptions, for example, in the investment screen, what they think is critical. So again, there's still lots to do, but considering where we're coming from, I think it has moved quite a lot. And yeah, on these other aspects, maybe I skip them on IP protections, as was mentioned. Professor Tsunami, I think here we're really in Europe not quite as advanced. There is discussion. The Commission has also identified this. It said it wants to be more assertive. It wants to even use sanctions if there's theft of European IP, for example, but it's really not clear how this will play out or what exactly it tends to do. And last point on export controls, a huge topic also, of course, specifically with the American partners and also for Japan. On paper, there has been some progress. There's been a reform last year of the EU's export control regime, but yeah, unfortunately, has been, I think, very low, the lowest common denominator, if you will. The Commission has barely any power. The member states remain in control, and there hasn't been really a debate among the member states of what technologies is it actually that they want to control, or what technologies that we might export are actually harmful. There has been a very narrow debate on those technologies that might be used for surveillance purposes. Surveillance technology in Xinjiang, there's a lot of European companies who have been active in that space, for example. But that's been one part of the debate, and other parts of the debate, what kind of civilian technologies, for example, may be used in China's military, civil military fusion program. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, there's barely any assessment in Europe of what technologies might fall under this. So in sum, I would just say that, you know, on all these fronts, there is discussion taking place, some are more advanced than others. And I fully agree with Sint, of course, that the key issue is that there's a lot of policy development, but we don't have this comprehensive approach at all yet in Europe. There's a lot of different moving pieces coming together. And as Sint said, starting off with some sort of coordination mechanism would already be very helpful. Back in 2019, when Japan introduced its directorate in the National Security Council, you know, I thought that this is something we should at least do. We don't have a National Security Council in Europe, but we have a council. We have working groups in the council who look on transatlantic aspects and on China and so on, but none of them looks really at economic security more comprehensively, for example. That would be sort of a minimum step, I think, to be done. And then, of course, the big ticket item, which I'm sure we discuss now, and I'll leave it at that, is really cooperation. There's a lot going on in Europe, there's a lot going on in Japan and in America, but how do we actually align all these approaches and to not fall into the trap of economic nationalism? And some of them, as Sint said, that's really the big ticket item that's on the agenda in the next months and years. And certainly EU-Japan has a big role to play here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tobias, for those comments. I think you've also hit on several key points. Of course, there is the factual observation that in some respects the debate in Japan is ahead of the state of play in Europe. In other specific areas, you see things very much moving in parallel. But your last point about in a way, this is something that speaks to the division of competences in Europe, because of course, in the concept of economic security, you start bringing policy competences together that we in Europe have distributed over multiple layers of government, because you picked up on the theme of national security, where the European treaties say, well, national security is, according to Article 4, fundamentally a member state responsibility. But then, of course, all these economic issues are legislated to a significant extent at the European level. Let me perhaps inquire whether Professor Tsunami wants to respond to any of this. We will also gradually then start opening up the floor for Q&A. I've seen there is already one question that has come in on the Q&A box in writing from Wolfgang Pape, asking what is the potential Japanese equivalent of a supply chain law to protect human rights, etc., beyond only national security concerns. I think that's an important debate. How far do you go in taking concerns into account? So do you adopt a very strict or a very broad, more values-based definition of security in that respect? I also would like to flag to all the participants in this virtual format, we are on the record. We are intending to make the video recording of this session available on our YouTube channel. So just that you're aware of that. Everyone on the panel was, of course, already informed thereof. But so, Professor Tsunami, would you care to respond to any of the issues that has been mentioned, and perhaps already take on the first question that has been posed by Mr. Pape in the chat? And in the meantime, we would welcome further comments and questions from all of you in the audience.
Well, thank you very much for these valuable comments. They're all very useful for me to think about further in some of the economic security debate that we're going on at the moment. Tobias, thank you for the audience to remind about one of the first real step is really establishing the economic security unit in our National Security Council, and to have that economic security as one of the things that they take it a very serious objective for their activities, and that of course led to the this appointment of the minister in charge of economic security. Now, if this law passes, then they'll create a permanent sort of unit in the cabinet office to take care of the economic policy more comprehensively as an entire policy area package. And seeing yes, I think I agree with you. I think there's a lot of issues when we talked about economic policy, security policy. They look at more negative side of it. What are the negative impacts on this, or how much of the restrictions that will be imposed on some of the business activities that they, or who controls it, who has more, that sort of debate. But there is a positive side to it. I think it is very important to realize some of those, because of having this kind of system now, that some of the R&D corporations with allies and some of the key areas have more government, private sector cooperation in promoting those technologies and share those technologies with the rest of the world. One of the reasons that the debate in Japan about the introduction of security clearance, for instance, really came not about protecting or making sure that bad guys are not involved in the development of the critical technologies, but it's really about helping the Japanese, some of the, say, software companies or software houses or IT companies that are wanted to get into the business of, say, cybersecurity or with our allies, for instance, and not having this kind of security clearance system that would really makes it harder for Japanese companies to really get into the business with the say emerging technologies like cybersecurity with the Western allies and allied cooperation and the partners. So that was kind of the sort of the motivation behind. So firstly, the debate of this security clearance issue. So yes, so I think thank you very much for hiding, pointing that importance or positive side of the effect in this law. And I couldn't really emphasize enough is that I think that at the end of the day, with the Japan's effort in this economic security law, would allow Japan to be more effective partner with other Western allies in these areas. And I think this is something that would make it a new opportunity for Japanese stakeholders, Japanese business partners, Japanese scientists and engineers, and I think and development of these areas of these emerging technology really, not only it's costly and that, but also it has to, the speed is important, and so the partnership is very important. So I think that's sort of also the motivation of this debate here in Japan. And the question about the human rights, that's a very important issue, I think. Thank you very much for pointing that out. The resilience and or protection of the supply chain, I also came from the debate from our experience in the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami. And most, that the natural disaster of that magnitude really had impacted the Japanese economy, although it was more, the impact is really concentrated on the northern part of Japan. But because of the supply chain, the way that has been all set up is that the major manufacturers in Japan stopped their operations for weeks. And because of this vulnerability of supply chain, not only for national security reasons, but also natural disasters. And should we think about having a double track or some of the back, sort of the backup kind of system for at least for some of the key products or key manufacturers are going to be very important. So that part also came as a discussion. And of course, national security by a large role, is very important. And human rights, I think we are now even in the government debating about whether to consider the human rights as one of the important our diplomatic or our diplomacy and in terms of really engaging the issue of human rights into Japan's relations with other allies or other countries. Of course, if we recognize the human rights as some of the key sort of the way as we recognize it as a sort of a national security issue, that policy level, I think, would have a tremendous importance to think about human rights as the first, to include in the first or second pillar of the key infrastructure, or even the first pillar of it's again the area where should government can step in and trying to regulate, or some have a kind of a policy vis-a-vis our private sector business activities that are based on the human rights and also issue is. And we don't, I think we are, I think that are debating now, but we don't see that much, that sort of like the policy, like the economic security yet imposed on this human rights issue at the moment.
Thank you very much, Tsunami-san. There is another question, actually two questions that are now entered into the Q&A. I will read them out and also inquire whether any of the panelists would like to shed further thoughts on those. There is a question by Mark Stevens whether the economic statecraft of Japan will be integrated in Japan's overall defense policy, or should we still think of economic security and defense policy as two conceptually distinct issues? And then there is a question by Theo. What should be the overall goal of economic security policy? Should it be strategic autonomy, indispensability, technological leadership, or maybe something else altogether? So what is the end objective that is worth pursuing, that is implicit in this new legislative package? Tsunami-san, would you care to respond first, and I then turn to Sint and Tobias, if that is okay? Yeah.
Thank you. Those are very great questions. Thank you very much for putting that up. And I think the first issue is, quite honestly, it's whether the defense policy be part of the economic security policy. Yes, of course, they're part of it. I think this is very, very important. So the way to think about as that because the law actually in the basic principle says that the linkage of the economic policy for the sake of national security objective is the way that it's the kind of the ultimate aim of this law. So which in essence brings the defense policy debate with the economic statecraft or economic security policy debate in a way in together of the two. But of course, depending on some of the issues, of course, when we talk about the defense policy in Japan, by law, by constitution of Japan, of course, that we are allowing the defense to only for the defense of the Japanese interest, and when it comes to economic statecraft, it's about implementing or leveraging our economic statecraft for the purpose of our national interest in the lines of international or foreign policy area. If we think about this with a defense policy, I think it's more some of the issues that are quite delicate and depending on the some of the cases and so on. So I wouldn't, yes, and so in a nutshell, they are all, of course, be part of it. That's the reason why we say it's a comprehensive sort of the package of all this. That would include our interest in national security and our overall interest in national security to bring all these elements of the economic policy to it. So that would, of course, has in essence has some relationship, connection with the defense strategy. But sometimes we have to be careful not to just put this all together at once. So there's that question there. And the second question, which was to do with the overall goal of economic, and of course that the thing that Theo mentioned all these things about strategic indispensability, or we call it strategic autonomy of things and all these things are part of it. But at the end, what we are aiming at is, because of the interdependency of our economy, some of the activities both in non-physical economic space, but also cyberspace, that we need to have a set of a standard and a goal or rules that would allow us to enjoy the kind of benefits that brings from these business activities or the economic activities in these fields. And but unfortunately, those rules and the ways that we do things in a very shared platform or shared view sometimes need to be protected if being challenged. And the way to do that, we need to have a ways, means to protect ourselves to the way that we believe that our economy should be in, and be conducted in particular rules. So I think when we started talking about here in Japan on this economic security vision, it's all about Japan being part of the very important player in securing this common economic and socio-economic rules that we all have to cherish and protect. That's why the former Prime Minister Abe went to Davos and introduced the free flow of data principle that we think that it's very important for all of us to make sure that, so it's not just, you know, about security, but at the end, I think this is something that we are trying to achieve. So I guess those are the two questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Tsunami-san. Let me turn to Tobias and Sint. Would anyone care to add anything on these issues?
Well, for me, the goal of a policy on economic security is very clear. It's the security of our economy. And this is, as Professor Tsunami said, this is translated into 4 categories. Into the category of strategic autonomy, meaning in critical sectors, we want to be sovereign in our decision making. But this also means creating a level playing field for our own companies, security of critical infrastructure, and also protection of our economic and scientific potential. So for me, this actually, in economic security means all that. With respect to the other question, I think as security, defense, and economy are intertwined, a policy with respect to one of the topics necessarily touches upon the other. To take the Belgian example, we have a very important maritime sector. This is very important for our economy. And here our armed forces have an important role. For example, to protect our supply chain, to protect the ships in the Strait of Hormuz, for example, to protect our harbors. So I think without actually saying that economic security should be a different or a separate topic in a defense policy, I think they are necessarily intertwined. Yes. Thank you.
Thanks, Sint. Tobias, anything to add from your side?
Yes, maybe the last question that came in was on how could we cooperate with Japan, Europe and Japan, on economic security, whether the 2018 strategic partnership agreement, which was agreed together with the free trade agreement back then, whether this could be a platform. My impression is that no. I did think so also some time ago, that this could be an interesting platform. It's phrased quite broadly, the kind of cooperation that could be taking place on strategic issues in this SPA from 2018. But really, it was drafted at the time, at least on the European side, by the EAS, and the language is just too broad to really go into the nitty-gritty of economic security. Rather, we have, I think, a template, the Europeans have a template that really goes to the essence of the kind of cooperation, kind of new economic cooperation that we have to pursue now. And that is the EU-US Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council, the TTC. It really is a new way of how do we want to cooperate on economic policy with our partners from from 15 years of economic policy, economic foreign policy being really free trade agreements, tariffs, and of course also regulatory issues, but to one that is much broader in scope and which has different working groups. So in the TTC, all these issues that we just discussed in discussion, they have working groups on export controls, on investment screening, on technical standards, on industrial policies, on supply chains, on strategic infrastructure. So it's really a vast sort of network, a talking shop where these things can be discussed. What will be the outcome of this? I don't know, of course, but I think that's really the right approach. And Japan and America, for example, have also advanced these different international frameworks. There's the US-Japan supply chain security dialogue. This is also particularly on semiconductors, but potentially also other supply chains. So this is also the extension. Both the Americans and the Japanese are looking into supply chains. Let's look into them together, of course. There's also the US-Japan, I think there's an R&D, so research and innovation cooperation framework for 6G already, where both countries have committed already resources. Professor Tsunami will know much more about this. But in other words, there's really new venues coming up where these issues are addressed. And I think the TTC, I think, is really the non plus ultra here, at least on the kinds of issues covered. And ideally, I think we could extend this or have something similar with Japan, Korea, Taiwan, potentially on smaller things like the TTC, or expand the TTC to bring in new partners. I think that is, we have to think about these new frameworks that go beyond the things that we negotiated 7 years ago. And there's much room and there's much development on this space.
Thank you very much, Tobias. So you already fast forwarded a bit to the question that Matteo Graziani posted in the Q&A box on whether the 2018 strategic partnership agreements can be useful in improving cooperation, and you're effectively saying, well, it's a bit too generic. The TTC model is arguably more appropriate, precisely because it goes into greater technocratic detail, so to speak. Perhaps that's something that Professor Tsunami also still wants to comment upon. But there's also another question that was posed in the Q&A by Daiki Harada, who was wondering what is the impact of Japan's new economic security policy on international science, technology, and innovation cooperation with the European Union and other countries. I think that's perhaps also a topic that deserves to be elaborated upon in more detail. I know there are also many academics in the amongst the participants today, as we're all in our respective universities engaging with international partnerships and international mobility. I think that's worthwhile to sort of try and distill in detail what that exactly means, translating this economic security framework into international science and technology cooperation. Tsunami-san, would you care to pitch in with some thoughts on these 2 points?
Yes, thank you. I mean, Tobias had already answered the first part of the question, and I don't have much to add. But just to agree with what he has said, I think the 2018 SPA is a sort of the step forward. But at the time, I remember when we had debating with the EU and Japan in developing cooperation plan for science and technology innovation and what. But I think by having more concrete sort of discussions of sort of key infrastructure or the global supply chain and how we can cooperate together to make sure that they are resilient are going to be a very important big step in the advancing our cooperation in concrete way, not just the language, but having the hopefully at the end to have the great project and partnership project with the EU in those areas that we have identified. Of course, you know, we can talk, I mean, when we talk about the key products, critical products, such as batteries, you know, pharmaceuticals, I mean, they're not like, you know, we don't mean that they all has to be made in Japan or this, it's just impossible to have everything. It's just, I mean, and no, but just to make sure that those key products are actually be protected with our allies and our partnership with, and particularly with the EU, and we already, you know, collaborating in energy area with Europe, and it's very important to collaborate on the new advanced you know, technologies around the latest next generation of nuclear or other sort of energy related technologies. And I mean, these are very important, I mean, space, cyber, deep sea exploration, you know, all these areas are all collaborative projects. Nothing, this is not a one country or one nation or one university as a project. It's all has to be done in a bigger framework, and to ensure that bigger framework to be effective, we are hoping to use this economic security law to push Japan to that level of cooperation. And Harada-san's point about this international cooperation, well, I think having, now that we have Harada-san working in our representative office in Brussels, I think with the EU, I'm confident that he will make sure that this economic security law doesn't translate in the way that to limit our cooperation and exchange of science and scientists between EU and Japan. We don't. Of course, that just goes against our spirit of this law. Of course, you know, more cooperation, more reliable cooperation in a critical areas that we need to be cooperated with, and that would give us more platform to share our information, share our data, share our technology to make sure that we have better to protect our ways of doing business and our economic society, as Sin mentioned. So I think we shouldn't really take this as a way of restricting any of these activities. So yeah, Harada-san, I'm counting on you.
Thank you very much. As we are nearing the end of the time we planned for this webinar, there's perhaps one broader issue that I wanted to quiz myself, all of you, about, and that is the following. Our vocabulary about economic security is quite defensive in its orientation. And we also notice that perhaps the most important parts of legislative initiatives in this realm, it may not be possible to legislate all the details about how the economy works and how the security relevance then needs to integrate into those discussions. But economic security as a sort of concept in our governmental administration, in our legislative terminology, it has this important awareness raising function that we all benefit from. But there is, of course, also another side to the story, namely that we also, as advanced industrialized economies, wield considerable economic influence in the wider world ourselves. And today's crisis with the war in Ukraine and the international response with all the sanctions targeting the Russian economy are a good example thereof. We also wield considerable economic statecraft instruments ourselves. So my question to all of you, and that's really meant to sort of allow you to formulate concluding remarks in the coming minutes, is that economic security concepts useful to think of both protecting ourselves and how we go deliberately, carefully about wielding our own economic influence in the wider world at the same time. So both the offensive and defensive aspects thereof, in terms of how we think of the economic component of our foreign policy, so to speak. Shall we perhaps go in reverse order? Tobias, you start, then Sint, then Tsunami-san.
Yes. So I agree with you, Alexander. There is economic security. I think you're right. It can serve sort of as a awareness-raising concept for policymakers that economic links may be more fragile than we thought, and the implications of that fragility, of that vulnerability, might be more critical to us than just some business losing money somewhere, but might be more critical to societies at large, to our technological development in the future, and so on. Is economic security, though, too much of a sort of defensive term? I would say no, but I do agree that in Europe, I think it often still is. We have not used this term very often in the past, deliberately, I think, because it does have a sort of negative connotation, the security aspect, I think. And however, we have done, of course, economic security all our lives. I mean, this was kind of my introductory statement. The WTO securing sort of the legal framework around what is allowed and what isn't allowed was a guarantor of economic security. The kind of economic links we had are also guarantors of economic security, and competitiveness of industries, that they have export markets and have a competitive home market, are also, of course, aspects of economic security. However, you're right, the debate is currently, at least in Europe, certainly more on the protective side, but I would say that's already breaking up a little bit. There's more and more focus on what can we do actually abroad. We have the global gateway strategy. We have, as I said, the Trade and Technology Council, which is really about cooperation. We speak now here with Japan as partners. And I think, at least I hope, that dimension will really become the more dominant dimension once we get some defensive protective measures in place, which we are currently. We've really focused and shift how can we ensure economic security as partners abroad. Let me give you maybe one example, and then I finish off. Because Professor Tsunami mentioned also ways of Europe and Japan cooperating and on supply chains. And it is fundamentally, we have, I think, a lot of fields where we could cooperate. For example, the battery supply chain, the hydrogen supply chain. These are supply chains that are emerging still, that are quite critical to both Europe and to Japan. And it will require to build new global value chains. We won't be able to build them all in Europe or all in Japan. And we have, building these supply chains is, of course, business is doing this, but there is a way of guiding business of what kind of value chains or supply chains they might be doing. And Japan has been doing that quite successful in the past. Its infrastructure investments in Southeast Asia, it has built major supply networks for its industries. And we have, with the global gateway and strategic infrastructure financing, again, opportunity to also shape in a way where we would like potentially supply chains to run more closer at home, maybe, or with close allies like Japan and others. And there's a real opportunity to say, what kind of instruments do we have? We both have finance instruments, trade instruments, investment instruments abroad, and merging our infrastructure connectivity agendas. I think there's huge potential, especially for these supply chains that aren't there yet, because these are emerging technologies, that we can really do a lot for our common economic security that is outward looking rather than inward looking. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Sint, any concluding thoughts from your side?
Well, I think for me, the difference is between economy as an instrument or economy as a goal. And economy as a goal, I think this refers to your defensive interpretation of the concept, where we really want to protect our economy, which I would say is part of economic security, part of the national security. So for me, responsibility of the member states. And then you have economy as an instrument, which is the more offensive interpretation of the concept, and which, of course, is related to the defense interpretation, because you can only use your economy as an instrument if you have a strong economy. If you're threatening or using economic sanctions, you can only credibly threat with these economic sanctions if you do have a strong economy. So I think they're necessarily intertwined. Yes.
Yeah, I very much agree on that point. Tsunami-san, concluding thoughts from your side.
Alexander, thank you for actually posing the very important question at the end of the concept of economic security. Has we always been a discussion, even among ourselves in Japan, as we are preparing for the bill, about the concept of economic security, because it's very wide, which includes both the defensive side and then and offensive nature of the both within the law. So we even have the sort of the 2x2 table with the defensive nature and the offensive nature, and what the pillar number one goes into this part, and pillar number two goes to this part, and this kind of policy goes into in between, or have sort of, even mapping that we did was really trying to understand what we mean by economic security. And I think the concept really didn't drive what we need to be doing in this sense, but it's more of the needs of things that we have to be doing to prepare in terms of the creating a system and the legal institutions to support these activities. And then what we're going to call this as an overall sort of the name of it is economic security. And of course, there's some people in the process brought the argument of economic statecraft. And I remember as a graduate student at Columbia University in political science, the course that I took was a Professor David Baldwin. And I think he's one of the first guys to really come up with a book on economic statecraft. And I remember back in 1990s or late 80s, we kind of debated the merit of this concept. I mean, as an academic, it's a very interesting concept. But as when we talk about the actual policy design, this is something is still. I mean, there are a lot of questions that are going around, but I think it's coming back. I saw some of the books coming back to revisiting this economic statecraft in the 80s again in today's context. So what I hope is for all of us to come up with a better concept or better naming to it, to really mean what we mean Otherwise, I think once we start delivering this policy law, and then there will be a lot of debate and confusion, some confusion, but it's a broad concept, both as Sim mentioned, that's exactly what we are trying to do. So thank you very much for pointing that out. Thank you.
Thank you, Tsunami-san. William Shakespeare once wondered in writing whether a rose, if it were not called a rose, would smell as sweet. And I think the same can be said about economic security. The names or the labels we apply might vary, but it is nonetheless an important conceptual foundation for thinking through strategic level policy making. And I think what's important then is to go into the specifics and to deal with the technocratic detail that gets codified in law and regulations and administrative structures for governing societies. We are already in overtime, so I'll wrap up here, but I would like to very warmly thank both Professor Tsunami, Professor Dubois, and Tobias Gierke for sharing all their thoughts with us. Also, thanks to everyone in the audience. You brought forward excellent questions, and I hope you all enjoyed the debate as much as I did. We look forward to welcoming you again at future Egmont activities. With that, it is over and out for today, but let me wish all of you a productive day or a nice evening, depending on where you are, and looking forward to seeing you all again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.